I'm Tyler Taylor. I'm a member of the Unitarian Church here, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this month's second Sunday Forum. And I'm especially excited to have Deborah Taffa as our speaker. I've heard her speak in Santa Fe. I've read multiple reviews of her recent book, and so I'm really looking forward to hearing from her tonight. Before I give you more info about Deborah, just some info about some format things. After her talk, which will maybe be in the 25, 30-minute range, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. Deborah's book is for sale right outside these doors on the right, if you're interested in picking up a copy. We'd also love to have you come to the fellowship hall just a little further to the right and join us for conversation, refreshments. There's an incredible array of goodies out there that I had fun getting: cookies, crackers, ice cream, decaf coffee, sodas, fruit juice. I went a little crazy, what can I say? And we have gluten-free options there too. The restrooms are located a little to the left outside these doors, maybe just about 10 yards down on the left. I'm a person with hearing loss, so I'm very sensitive to whether people can hear adequately. So if you're not able to hear well, please raise your hand, and so we can see what we can do about that. The church has a pretty wide variety of forums and other adult religious education programs. We do our second Sunday forums at 11:45 on, yes, the second Sunday. And then on the third or fourth Sunday, we have a comparative religion class done by James Carroll, who's amazing and has been doing this for years and covered many religions. So that's another option. If you're interested in getting on an email list so that we can let you know if you're not a member about these things that are going on, especially the forums, there's a list out where the food's located, and please sign up on there. Finally, some background on Deborah. She lives in Santa Fe and is the director of the MFA program in creative writing at the Institute of American Indian Arts there. She's the winner of the National Endowment of Arts Fellowship and the Penn Gene Stein Grant. And she's received fellowships from McDowell, Hedgebrook, Tin House, A Public Space, the Ellen Malloy Foundation, and the Kranzberg Arts Center. That's a lot, right? She's a citizen of the Quatsan Nation and the Laguna Pueblo. Please give a warm welcome to Deborah Taffa.
This feels nice and cozy, intimate space, lovely. Thank you for having me. I grew up in Farmington, New Mexico, but I was born on the Yuma Reservation, which is in southeastern California. And we would come to New Mexico a lot even before we moved back here because my father is full-blood indigenous, half Yuma Quetzan and half Laguna Pueblo, but my mother, her entire family came from Socorro, New Mexico. So her last name was Herrera. Her mom's last name, my grandma Mary, her last name was Lopez. And so, unbeknownst to me until I got quite a bit older, when you look at my mom's genealogy, it says Siriaco Herrera. It has a bunch of Hispanic names, and then every once in a while it says Pueblo woman, Pueblo woman, Pueblo woman, dotted throughout that history. And it was weird growing up because my mother never wanted to think of herself as indigenous. She always called herself Spanish or Hispanic, even though her family had come to the United States probably in the 1600s. And so all my life I felt this tension between my father's family and my mother's family. I mean, obviously she was not racist, or she would not have married a full-blood indigenous man, but there was some minimal amounts of, I mean, more than minimal, there was kind of a shame about being Native in this country during my childhood. So my parents were born before the civil rights movement, and I came to understand that my mother's family hid their indigenous inheritance because they were frightened. It could be a dangerous thing to be a Native person in this country prior to the civil rights movement. So that's some of what plays into the book, which is called Whiskey Tender. It was published by HarperCollins, and at best, I have been a very reluctant memoirist. It took me 15 years to let this go. I was like fighting to hang on to it. And my thesis advisor in Iowa City wrote me every year after I graduated and said, "Where's the book? Why haven't you published it?" And I was so frightened because when you're writing about your family, you don't want to get things wrong. Imagine now that you decided to write a book that exposed sort of the darkest secrets and the most difficult things that you know about your family that no one else knows. So my appearance as a person walking around, people can't see that my father was tried and convicted of manslaughter when he was only 16 years old. People can't see the struggles that my family has been through with the open pit uranium mines near Laguna Pueblo, or the assimilation or the Indian boarding schools that my grandparents went through. Like the effects of that are things that when I was raised by my parents in the 1970s and 80s, I was supposed to minimize and hide. You know, I was supposed to be a straight A student. They sent me to Catholic schools. My dad really believed in the American dream, and he said this country was a meritocracy, and that if we worked really hard and we were model minority kids, that we could pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and succeed. And that was a really hard thing for me to endure, because when I went to Catholic school, they didn't teach us anything about our Native histories. And so, you know, we learned about Plymouth Rock and Manifest Destiny, and the curriculums that we were offered never celebrated any of the histories of the Americas. But as a child, you can feel that something is wrong. You know that there's tension in your community. You know that people look at you like you're different, and you look at your dad like he's different, and you don't know why, you know? And then when you get to high school, they drop in your lap the history of the Trail of Tears. They drop in your lap the Sand Creek Massacre. And it's what they teach you begins at the juncture of genocide, and that's really hard, you know? And so I examined the educational system in this book a great deal, because I wish that we could start teaching kids about the grand archaeological, botanical, astronomical accomplishments of Native people in the Americas prior to the arrival of European settlers. I wish that we could honor the people who loved this land. My ancestors loved it better than any of us do, took really good care of it, you know, and that they gave Native kids some pride. So I guess ultimately, I wrote this book for myself because I had to figure out who I was. I had to heal myself, and I did that through writing, but I published it for my grandkids. I finally let go of it because at the beginning of the pandemic, my daughter had just gotten married to a young Native Hawaiian man, and they had 2 little kids who are, you know, they look indigenous themselves, and they live on Oahu. And I looked at them and I thought, oh my goodness, what if I die before they've had a chance to grow up? What if I become an ancestor before they have mapped their survival as indigenous men, able to negotiate a balance between being American citizens and earth-carrying people, between Christianity and Native wisdom, between capitalism and our more communal forms of tribal caring? So this book maps not only my coming of age, but my spiritual journey and the ways in which I made my peace with this country its governmental policies, and the harder, often hidden histories. I tried to make it funny and engaging and entertaining, even as I weaved in like the hard histories of the Major Crimes Act, the birth of the American Indian Movement, the Indian Relocation Program, the history of Indian boarding schools, assimilation and termination policies, the open pit uranium mines at Laguna Pueblo that killed my grandmother. And my friends are telling me, you know, it's funny because you weave it all into the story of your childhood, and every once in a while you digress towards history, but then you quickly pull it back to your family story to make it fun. And I said, well, that was the goal. I said, it's kind of like a bait and switch. You get people to think they're going to read like Reservation Dogs meets the Southwest. And then you kind of give the hard medicine. They, oh, don't use that term. They said, tell people that you baked a cupcake made out of zucchini. And I like that better, I think. So that's kind of the background of the book. And I'm just going to read a couple of little sections, and then we'll go to the Q&A, so you get a taste of what the language is like. And I think I'll read from the kind of towards the end, which is when all of the anxiety that I have felt growing up has finally bubbled to the surface. So I'll just give you one more little anecdote to illustrate, I think, an important aspect of my childhood. And my grandson, at Christmas, he was 5 years old. He's in kindergarten. And his teacher sent a note home from school, and it said that he was such a good speaker, and he's so smart, and he does so well in class, and that she wants him to try out for the head speaker role in the Abraham Lincoln Day Parade that they're going to have in February. And he's competing against all the kindergartens at his school. And so over the break, I help him memorize a substantial amount of lines as a 5-year-old, you know, and he's going to go compete for it. And he got the role, but as I was teaching him all of these lines about Lincoln and Lincoln Day, I was thinking to myself, at what point do I tell him that Abraham Lincoln was responsible for hanging 38 Lakota and Dakota warriors after the Civil War in the largest mass execution that this country has ever seen? Obviously, you don't want to tell a 5-year-old that story. You don't want to tell a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old that story. You want your kids to believe that the president's good, that policemen and firemen are good. You want them to believe that they belong in this country, that people will like them, and that they, you know, that it's a good place to be. And so at what point do you break your child's heart as an Indigenous parent? This is what you continue to ask yourself. And I think my parents, they erred on the side of being too cautious. They kept secrets from us for too long. And when you pair that with Catholic schools, that, sure, they're giving you a better education than the public schools, but they're not giving you the truth about history, it's a recipe for disaster. Because kids reach an age, I reached an age, when I discovered the harder truths on my own, and then it was given to me in school, and I fell into a very deep depression. It was a very difficult thing for me to come to peace with, because I had been raised to believe in the American dream. And so this comes after my breakup, is how I'll set it up. A ton of rain fell the summer after my overdose, which made the waters near our campground rise and darken. This meant big trout on the feed and Dad angling to fish every weekend. Each time he suggested a trip, I suspected he just wanted an excuse to check in on me, but I didn't mind. I was happy enough to have a reason to leave the house. That summer, my family circled the wagons. After leaving the hospital, my parents had taken me to a Japanese restaurant all by myself. The restaurant belonged to a friend of my father's, and the portions were so tiny we all came home wanting. Since then, they'd been watching. Even though I told them I felt better, they were concerned. I tried to reassure them. I said a burden had been lifted now that we'd talked. The struggles that had plagued me for years, our family's forced assimilation and the genocide we'd suffered at the hands of our own government were in the open, and the silence and shame we'd always agreed upon as a family were gone. My grief had exploded into view. My resentment had been named and spoken, and now that my parents understood the source of my depression, I felt an enormous relief. They were concerned that I hadn't shared my thoughts in a suicide note, though, and worried that I needed the counseling the hospital had recommended, but that our insurance didn't cover. So instead, they worked hard to make sure I was never left alone. My little sister Monica asked if I wanted to hang out with her and her nerdy friends nearly every day that summer, and even my big sisters Joan and Lori came home to keep me company. They liked singing that ridiculous Melissa Manchester song about the clowns. Don't cry out loud, just keep it inside and learn how to hide your feelings anytime I started acting sad. And on fishing trips with Dad, they always wanted to reminisce about the years we spent growing up in Yuma, back when we oldest four girls called ourselves the Jackson Four. On weekends, when Dad succeeded in convincing the lot of us to trek up north to Durango, our parents would drive up in the truck with the babies, and the rest of us would follow behind them in the van. One Friday in July, I was stretched out on the back bench, blankets, sleeping bags, and book bags on the ground at my feet, when Joan and Lori recalled an old nickname of mine. One they said showed how prescient they had been because it identified me as crazy from the get-go. Mary Hartman was a character in a satirical soap opera that spoofed regular soap operas. She was a nervous housewife with major issues. Her friend got paralyzed, her daughter was kidnapped, and the cops arrested her grandfather for being the town flasher. Yet all she could think about was the waxy yellow buildup on her floors. At the end of the first season, her tendency to sublimate and appropriate the language used in commercials landed her in the psych ward. Oh my God, Joan said, laughing. Mom was obsessed with that stupid show. Remember that little boy character? What was his name? Jimmy Joe Jeter, Lori exclaimed. Monica couldn't remember, so Lori explained. He was an 8-year-old evangelist who got electrocuted when a television fell in his bathtub. You didn't call me Mary Hartman because you thought I was crazy, I said. It was because of my hair. I distinctly remembered them telling me to go stand by the television set when Mary Hartman was on so they could compare our braids. It was a time when Mom only combed our hair once every 2 weeks, and my braids got loose and bagged out over my ears just like Crazy Mary's. Talking about the show made them remember something else. How we used to draw squares on the ground to play house outside near the carport, and everyone called everyone else Mary. Mary, can I borrow some flour? Sure, Mary, why don't you go to the store? Geez, Mary, didn't you hear the price of beer? Sometimes we would stop and try to convince each other to take a different name. Why don't you be Sarah? You be Sarah, I'm Mary. One time we got into such a big argument, Monica went inside and came out with her little red belt. She swung it around just like Dad swung his when he was mad. Only she was ruthless, and she tried to catch our legs with the buckle. Joan was laughing so hard remembering Monica with her belt, I thought she might wreck the van. Oh my God, I remember how we ran from her, and she was hitting us, and you got a bunch of goat head stickers in your foot. Back then, Monica had cracked our ankle bones with her belt buckle, and we'd actually cried from the pain. But once she'd grown tired, we'd decided that playing with the belt was fun, and we kept trying to hit each other with it. We had taken turns chasing each other, and the whipping made us laugh, just as it was making us laugh now. It had been a long time since I thought about that day, but sitting there in the back of the van, I remembered how scary it was to hit them when they gave it to me, scarier than it had been to be hit. It started drizzling outside. Joan turned on the windshield wipers, and we grew quiet. But our memories of Yuma got me thinking. We'd been so little, yet the world had already taught us to accept a beating and brace ourselves for pain. It made me wonder if all Native kids felt so dehumanized by the start of preschool. I couldn't believe how insidious America was at making Native people believe the oppressor's low opinion of us. As we arrived at our campground and started unloading the van, I vowed to make my life better for the little girl I'd once been. I needed to push the self-doubt out of my heart. I needed to find the courage to get rid of the shame. I needed to resist the conditioning, propaganda, and hate, and make self-love my primary goal. And then I'm just going to jump ahead to the epilogue. It's only 3 pages, very short. Epilogue. A person teaches best what she needs to learn. And reconnecting with my homeland, rediscovering my center as it relates to my past, claiming my inheritance as a woman whose spirituality is deeply rooted in the desert, is what I most needed when I started writing this book. While my life's road did return me to the reservation in my 20s, it also spirited me away to Iowa City and St. Louis in my 30s and 40s. The demands of career and family make us all mobile, but there are seasons to life, and I always knew my ancestors would eventually call me home again. My Laguna grandmother, Esther, is the one who taught me that a deep intimacy with a homeland requires 3 things: sensory experiences of particular geographies, a storied history of the trails, and a deep caring about them. I remember her pinning laundry on the clothesline as she recited place names. Start with Sepina, a single word that encompasses the modern stories and old myths, the ponderosa pine and alligator juniper, the wild turkey and mule deer. Her list had other places that readers and lovers of the desert will recognize in English: Hesperus Peak, Aztec Ruins, Wheeler Peak, Chaco Canyon, Window Rock, the Painted Desert, Canyon de Chelly, the Zuni and Kachina Mountains. Her way of remembering was a constant. It was her way of being in her homeland, even as she was absent in Yuma. The word Sepina had power in her life, as it has power in mine now. Not only does it return me to my time with my grandma, but it also returns me to myself. I remember climbing the mountain's western slope with my 3 children in my 20s. I remember carrying my baby in a cradle board on my back while helping my 3- and 4-year-olds over large roots and fallen trunks at a glacial pace. Storied histories, sensory experiences, a deep caring, and the desire to be in certain places. My grandmother's commitment to place names was devotional. It was a way to keep her values intact, even as she lived on her husband's reservation. I have remembered this through the years when my homeland felt like a distant memory, difficult to conjure on the page. I remembered that human beings have always tied the most important events in their lives, moments of transcendent beauty, memories that hold numinous meaning, birth and death experiences, to tangible places. Geography is a shaping force that develops our sense of identity and morality. If I learned anything by listening to my grandmother's soft voice as she hung her laundry, it is that recitation, poetry, and writing are almost always born of nostalgia. My grandmother walked on long ago. In her lifetime, she never left the desert. While writing this book, I missed her, and I thought of my writing as a way of hanging bed sheets on the clothesline, scribbling words and place names to remember who I am, just as she taught me to do. Her relationship with the desert was physical, biological, moral, and above all, intimate and reciprocal. All my life, even when I've traveled, I've wanted my relationship with the desert to be that way too. Barry Lopez wrote, "If you're intimate with a place with whose history you're familiar, and you establish an ethical conversation with it, the implication that follows is this: the place knows you're there. It feels you. You will not be forgotten, cut off, abandoned. For 2 decades, I kept this quote in a notebook nearby me as I wrote. I told myself, the land remembers my name. When I felt the words were too difficult to render, I remembered that my ancestors could hear me reciting. I knew that our traditions had to change, not only for us and our grandchildren, but also for the world to hear echoes from the indigenous past, a time when the pace of life and the wisdom born of our relationship to the earth was still alive. I knew that our people had to change because change is the essence of life. This last year, living through a pandemic, becoming a grandmother for a second time, I began to hear the end of my tale, and it was as if the act of finishing meant the desert could finally call me home. Perhaps it is always better to write about a place from a distance, as Leslie Marmon Silko said about writing ceremony, because it's only in a state of nostalgia that we see things clearly. I wrote these pages mostly in the Midwest, where I often felt lost and alone, but they were finished in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I was invited to support the next generation of Native writers at the Institute of American Indian Arts. I don't know how many times I've heard young Native scholars tell me that they were trying to remember their ancestral culture's values and stories with trepidation in their voices, to which I always say, don't worry, your ancestors are keeping track of you. The totem pole, the Bodhi tree, the hearth. We are at home on this planet when we feel the sacred places rising up through our feet, when we embrace the mountains and desert arroyos as holy. The ancient ones walk beside us, and all we must do is keep our fingers on the pulse of music. If we listen, we can hear it rising up from the planet, the sound of the spirit that was, is, and always will be. Thank you. Are we going to do a Q&A, or do you just want to? Okay.
Yes, it's working. Can you hear me? Okay. So we're open to questions, comments, thoughts.
Thank you. Beautiful book. Forgive me, please. Is it Quetzalcoatl?
Quetzan.
Quetzan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a attitude that you write about very often that it would have been very tempting to draw parallels to the idea of non-attachment in other traditions. You did not heed that temptation, but can you speak more about that, please?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. So you've read the book already. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, you know, it was a really weird thing. I grew up as a minority Indian in a majority Navajo town because my dad was trained by the Indian Relocation Program, which was a governmental program that was designed to get Indians to move off the reservation in a grand migration. Their plan was they were just going to cancel the reservations and make us part of mainstream America. So, you know, when you're dirt poor and you're living on the reservation, my dad had to make a hard decision, like, we're going to move off reservation so you guys get food and go to a good school. So we did. And I was always like, our whole family had this cultural cringe because Navajo people have this very rich culture, right? They have their sheep herding cultures and they have their weaving. And when I would look back at the Yuma Quetzan people in my family, there wasn't a lot there. There weren't a lot. You know, we had like one ceremony that my grandfather's generation, every clan had a responsibility to the ceremony. It was our big ceremony. It was called the Karuk. And the family that carried song for the ceremony, the eldest person in the family died suddenly before he passed the song on. They had a meeting. They came out and they said, you know what? We're never doing the ceremony again. It's gone. It made me so upset, and I couldn't understand why. And then as I got older and I became more educated, I realized that this incredible non-materialist, non-attachment to physical things sort of stance was the central philosophy of the Yuma Quetzan people, which was that the physical world is only 50% of what we live. Our dreams in the dream world are a full 50. They're not some subsidiary thing that you do at night, but it's something that you enact. You know, our tribe is one of the only tribes in the country that built these huge geoglyphs that you can still fly over by Blythe, and people don't know how they shape them. You know, they're just so enormous. And so they talk about dream bodies and a dreamscape, kind of similar to the Australian people, the Aboriginal culture in Australia. We burned our houses, and all the objects that when a person died, everything got burned, and the government, they forbid us to do it at a certain point, but my great-grandma was the last one to have her entire house on the reservation set on fire. Everything was burned, all of the beautiful artwork that she made, because we're not supposed to cling to the physical belongings of people who came before us. So the ceremony that they put down and put away, even the ceremony and the song was considered something material. In my tribe's belief system, the only thing that will ever be a certainty in this world is that it's ephemeral, that it changes, you know, that our emotions change, that everything changes. Ceremony must change. And when I kind of finally got a grasp on that, I realized that I couldn't keep looking back. I couldn't keep looking back to try to recollect the traditions of my past. I could only look forward. And that has encouraged me in many ways to kind of come to a place where I'm redefining my own spirituality and I'm breaking taboos. Because this is a recording of a life that would be against the teachings of my tribe. It's a material object, and it tells a very private story. And that's part of why it took me so long, a huge ethical conundrum for me, right? Not only in revealing my family, but what was I doing and why? And ultimately, I think what I've come to land on is that indigenous people tend to be very private. Like, we don't share stories with people who are not indigenous. We don't invite people into our private ceremonies. We kind of have built a wall. It makes sense that we worry a lot about appropriation because so much has been taken from us. But the stakes are so high right now with climate change and a crumbling democracy. I really, really believe that now is the time for indigenous people to make an attempt to be more influential, to speak up about loving the earth, about caring for the democracy. Those are all aspects of our culture, our traditional culture, that we have handed on. We're in the background of everything American. You know, we're in many ways, this country borrowed and sustained itself off of the spirit of who my ancestors were, and yet we've been kind of hiding in the back room, afraid to speak. And so it was an incredibly bold act to publish this book and to do this thing that I did, you know, and it's scary. I've been traveling and talking to people. It's very frightening to be on stage. It's not my favorite part of the process for sure, but I feel a responsibility to indigenous futures and earth futures, and there's definitely an environmental thread in the book that if you've read it, you know about, yeah.
Deborah, you mentioned early about how your parents knew quite a bit about Indian boarding schools and the forcing of children to those. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about kind of how that shaped their lives, the communities they were from, and then, you know, what's the ripple effects in you?
Yeah, you know, I don't know. You guys must know people who like went to the Vietnam War, and they come back, and in the beginning they're just very quiet. Like my uncles were just like catatonic. They don't talk, and then after about 20 years, as they start to heal, suddenly it starts to come out. I often think of my parents. Like I've pondered many times. Why did they not talk to us more about the traumas that had happened nationwide to indigenous people? And I've always kind of jumped between possibilities. One is that their parents, and even my father's older brother, went to Indian boarding school, and they were basically trained to be janitors. They were not given an education. You know, they didn't really get what we would call a decent education at Indian boarding school. So it's possible that they were just completely ignorant about the political histories of the United States because their parents had died so young before they could speak about it. The other thing is that having your kid go away to Indian boarding school and be taken from you, then as a parent, you don't tell them the history and the mortality rates in the 30s and 40s and 50s. My grandparents died when they were, my dad was an orphan by the time he was 23. So that transmission of history hadn't been passed on. The other thing is like a deep shame, right? My mother in particular, when my dad would start talking about the poverty or the alcoholism that he had seen as a child, she would shush him, like, don't talk about that, don't talk about that. And the last thing I think with my father was, he always said, you're never gonna think of yourself as a victim. I don't ever want to hear you saying that you're a victim. You have to give 110% more than all the other kids. You're supposed to be the one who gets straight A's, is the orator at your class play, is the star basketball player, is, you know, he put this tremendous pressure. In that way, our story is an immigration story, because we left this sovereign nation that was our reservation. We migrated to mainstream America. There I was with my Walkman, listening to The Clash, like hanging out. All of that's in the book. I'm watching Laverne and Shirley and doing all the things that kids do. But my dad was saying, you guys must be model minorities. You must be model minorities. And it just put so much pressure on us. It broke me, for sure, you know, because I wanted to please him. I wanted to make him proud, and it was hard. So, you know, it's not only Indian boarding schools that affected my family. My father would not have been treated so harshly as a minor. His friend died in a car accident, hence the manslaughter thing. You know, you see Ted Kennedy that drowned a woman, left the body, and walked away scot-free. And he's an adult. And it was about the same year that it happened to my dad, maybe like within 12 months. My dad had that happen to him as a little kid, and they sent him to an adult prison for 3 years. That's incredible. That's because of the Major Crimes Act, right? The discovery of uranium happened in New Mexico, as most of you know. Navajo man found it. They funneled a bunch of Indian people into these polluting jobs in coal mines, uranium mines, power plants. We never hear that story because a lot of indigenous writers want to make it look like we're all very for the earth, and we are. But, you know, there's a generation of men in this country that were put between a rock and a hard place. They had a Hobson's choice. Do I allow my family to live on the reservation where there are no jobs? Or do I take this job as a welder and move my family to a town where my kids might be able to pull themselves up and get out, you know? And, you know, all my siblings and I are all very successful. 3 of my kids went to Yale. And for my dad, who never went to high school, and my mom, who never went to high school, that is a phenomenal leap. And I think it's because my parents were so hard on us. People who have been to Indian boarding schools, especially the women, they're not warm and cuddly. So I grew up with a lot of very stern maternal elders who they had a hard time kind of giving you that warmth as a child, you know. My mom was one of those. My grandma Esther from Laguna Pueblo was probably the exception to that, and she died of a very rare form of sinus cancer and refused to have chemotherapy because in Laguna culture, you're making space for a new soul to come into the world. Maybe she was just tired of the poverty and just was ready to go. I don't know, but it was a grand loss for me as a child. Yeah.
Other questions?
Deborah, I wonder, thank you, first of all. Mm-hmm. It was so moving.
Thank you for inviting me, Leona.
I'm wondering about the ways in which you found making peace with your mother.
Yeah, yeah.
I know that was problematic.
Yeah, she was such a strict Catholic, and she was very much like my way or the highway, you know what I mean? And her methods were kind of like to shame you, and to like, you know, I felt over-sexualized at a young age, and I was always worried about my purity, and she was just really hard on us, you know? And then she didn't want to admit, like I said, that she would never call herself Chicana, or, you know, she would never say, we came from Mexico. It was always like, you know, like they do in Santa Fe in northern New Mexico, there's a lot of pride in the Spanish conquistadors. And for me, that was like, I can't feel that. So we were at odds. And I think, you know, she passed away at the beginning of the pandemic. And before that, she had minimally been in the book. Like, I just didn't know how to handle her character. And then when she died, I was thrown into this terrible cycle of grief. I feel like if someone that you have a really loving relationship with, they die, there's a resolution in your soul that feels like, wow, we had a beautiful time together. With my mother, it felt like, wait, we hadn't finished. We hadn't resolved. I'd never found my grounding with you. It was very, very painful. And then she started to emerge in the book. And it was like, you know, when you write literature, and if you're writing for the big four publishers, they don't want flat characters. So it's not like you can purposely go out and crown anyone with a halo or giving anyone a black hat, you know? Even if you feel in your life, like my dad was my hero, I have to show his bad sides. And with my mom, I felt like she was always so hard on me. I had to dig deep to show the things that she did for us that were loving. And ultimately, the things I discovered about my mother was, you know, she couldn't have been more opposite than my dad. I never saw her drink in my lifetime. She was a complete teetotaler. She saved his life in that regard. And then, you know, she drove us to our appointments, and she was the room mother, and the team, you know, she would keep score at the games and stuff. She was always like the team mom. I think, though, that the thing that gave me the most peace with her was realizing that she was truly the tragic character in the book. Because she didn't have like quinceañeras, she didn't have a culture. And let's just think for a minute. I know it seems like a silly example, but let's think, what is this farm-to-table movement? It's people longing to have food that feels like it comes fresh out of the earth, and a slower pace of living, and everybody's sitting at the table. You know, in some ways, we all have an indigenous inheritance. Any of you, if you trace your family lineage back far enough, you hit some country, some land, some space where whoever lived there in your family lineage knew exactly when berry season was, when they should go out and get the berries to make pie. When were they going to go collect their nuts? When were they going to get their mushrooms? What animals did they trap and where? What kind of birds did they shoot to eat? I don't know what they did to feed themselves, but they had that intimate reciprocity with the land, right? And I think in some ways that we're all craving that a little more. We've become very tired of. And so in that way, this book is kind of a, it's me being the kid in our family that keeps telling everybody, what about that? What about that? Can we go back to that? Can we have a rite of passage that doesn't involve prom or getting my driver's license at the mall? Like, these things to me feel washed out. I want something deeper. I want something more meaningful. Ultimately, I came to look at my dad and said, wow, he has a lot of trauma in his family history, but he has this rich, wonderful, beautiful, recent connection to the land that I felt in his soul. Like, he's a very stable, wise person for all that he's gone through. And then I looked at my mother and I thought, she just didn't have that. And I think she was wounded by it. And I think that she could never find the voice for it. And I think ultimately she was a little bit jealous of the fact that my dad did have it, and that I wanted to go towards his family because of that reason. If my kids chose my husband's culture over mine, I would be hurt. So I started to see her with a more mature lens after she passed away. And ultimately, that enabled me to write a book that felt like a love story. You know, the biggest compliments I've gotten about this book, I think the Washington Post said, some reviewers are calling this an indigenous memoir, but it's not. It's an American memoir, full stop. And then others have said that word tender is completely true. Like it deals with a lot of difficult things, but ultimately it gives you a feeling of family love. There's humor in it, and it's a reclamation of what it is to be Indigenous in all the ways that are beautiful. I think we have enough Indigenous books that talk about the poverty and the commodity cheese and like just leave you with this feeling of sadness. I wanted my book to be uplifting for kids to read and to give them a map about how they can come to survive as well. I've landed on high ground. I'm happy as an adult. And when I look back at some of the stories I told in this book, and I think, if you had told me I was going to tell that story on a national stage when I was 27 years old, I would have been like, no way. I don't tell that story to anyone. And to have it now in the book, and I feel completely fine about it, is like, it's a testament to how much I've grown and, how I'm at peace with my history. I really am. Thank you all.
Another question I have is, you alluded to wanting Native people to be much more having a voice in this moment of crisis in the country. And I'm guessing that some piece of that is we need to start telling our history differently.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could talk some about what would that look like, maybe on a philosophical level or more on a practical level.
Yeah, I think that backing up in history, I think a lot of people, and I kind of portray this in a class that I am in junior high, it's an honors class, and we've talked so little about Native people, and then they bring in Dee Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and make us read big sections of it. And I mean, to go from having no one had really spoken about Indigenous histories very, very lightly, like about the East Coast, where I had never been in my life. Nobody talked about the fact that New Mexico had a Spanish influence that came up from the South. We didn't study about Juan de Oñate. I saw his statue everywhere, but I just was so profoundly ignorant. I think that a lot of people in America a lot of educators are afraid that if we tear down the idea of America as this beacon on a hill, right, that we're not going to have anything left. And I think it's actually the opposite. I married somebody who was born and grew up in Milan, Italy, and immigrated to the United States. And the first thing he asked me when we met was like, what is going on in America? Like, why don't you talk about your history or see it clearly? The silly thing is that everybody all over the world, right, they're like, what is happening in America? If you've traveled anywhere in the last 3-4 years, my taxi drivers are like, what is going on why are you guys, what is happening? We thought, and I'm like, it's like if you have a best friend who is pointing out a really central part of your personality and you refuse to see it. It's not a good look. It's embarrassing. Like self-reflection and seeing oneself clearly is a sign of maturity. And, I don't want to, for example, in my mom's family, I would be very sad if all of the Spanish cultural traditions in Santa Fe went away. It's what keeps it unique. It's about having a conversation between different cultures, sometimes that make you uncomfortable, and being okay with that discomfort. I'm uncomfortable by things that people say that come from a stance that is oppositional to my own. Scott Fitzgerald said, the sign of a brilliant mind is the ability to hold two opposing thoughts at the same time without going crazy. This is what is required of us as a diverse nation, the ability to listen and have civil discourse. I completely am against the hot take that you see on social media. I need a lot of time to think things over and to pray about it before I say anything. And people just want to shout at each other. You know what I mean? So I think when we get to a certain age, sometimes we're set in our ways. But I think that kids in schools now, I wish they could all read this book. I think that the younger you get to kids, the more they're able to develop their empathy by reading literature or engaging in art. And I think that literature and art have a way of presenting histories that's a little softer than politics or a straight-up history class. So storytelling, Colin McCann is doing a project called Narrative 4, where he goes into communities where people are embittered and embattled. He's from Ireland, so he grew up between the Protestant and Christian, like that schism over there. But he's been to the Middle East to do this. He brings kids from both cultures together. You pair up with a kid who's from the culture that you don't know very well. You both tell your stories. Then you come back to the room, and it's your job to tell your partner's story, and your partner tells your story. Why does that work? It's because stories, they create empathy. And we all need to exercise our empathetic muscles a little more. I guess that's what I would say. With my own kids, I took them down to Chichen Itza and Machu Picchu because I knew they weren't going to learn about it in school. And I talked to them, like I said, about the astronomical discoveries, the botanical creation of corn, which was wed between a grass and a fruit. Nobody knows how they did that. You know what I mean? There were many discoveries in the Americas that we don't celebrate. And I think when you start to celebrate the accomplishments of non-white cultures, then those kids have more pride, and they're less likely to act out and be angry. You know, we have a lot of angry youth in this country. Give them something to be proud of in their cultures, and you'll see their attitudes change. Yeah. Maybe this is the last question. Yeah, I don't want to keep you guys too long. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, it can be the last one. Yeah. Okay. I was raised here, and when I was a little girl in Santa Fe was the Indian school. Yeah. And they were beautiful buildings. I always thought they were. And then all of a sudden they're gone. Yeah. And I know what they represent. Instead of having them torn down and kind of erasing what they represent, yeah, could they have been made, like use that architecture, which was splendid, yeah, and have them be made into theaters or a school of learning of the culture, yeah, instead of against the culture? Could it have been used in a positive way instead of just erased?
Yeah, you know, in Phoenix, the old Indian boarding school was turned into a museum. So now you can walk through and see like the jerseys, because the one thing that they did have at a lot of Indian boarding schools that I think was a positive thing was they had sports teams. So, you know, football was greatly advanced by sort of the strategies that football teams at the Carlisle Indian boarding school used. They did handoffs and rushes. They did things that nobody had ever done before, and it spread through the world of football. You know, lacrosse. Native kids oftentimes are good at basketball. Those are all really good ways of lifting the steam. But I think, you know, when you go to Mexico and you go to Chichen Itza, the roads are paved. They treat it like a major tourist attraction. If you try to get to Chaco in the wrong season, there are potholes. There's no way to get in there. You know what I mean? It's just, this country has not invested very much in like preserving our archaeological sites or celebrating it all. This is the thing that's exciting to me about teaching students at IAIA, is that really only 70% of our student body is indigenous. And a lot of them have intersectional identities now because they're a younger generation. So they're half Dene and half Norwegian, or, you know, they're mixed. And then we have 30% that are not indigenous at all. They're BIPOC, though. Some of them are Palestinians, some of them are from India, some of them have disabled bodies, some of them are environmentalists. Why do they want to study with us? Because they know that we're trying to create a new definition of what it means to be American in our program. The writers coming out of our program, they want to be proud of being American citizens. They want to broaden the definition of what American citizenship looks like, right? I'm very encouraged by the next generation, and I have been very discouraged by what has happened in the publishing industry. So you guys all know N. Scott Momaday. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1968. They said immediately there was a Native American renaissance that emerged because of this prize. They published everything that they can find, everybody they could find who's now in their 70s. So we have Louise Erdrich, Leslie Marmon Silko, Simon Ortiz, just this big boon, Paul Gunn Allen, a bunch of people getting published in that generation. Then they got Sherman Alexie, who's Gen X like me, And he was the only Gen X person that they published for a very long time. It was like they said, we found our one Indian. They kept publishing the older generation, but in my generation, he was kind of it, right? Now we're going through what they call a new Native American literary renaissance. And I'm like, I don't want anyone to call it a renaissance, because that suggests a rise and then a fade out and it's gone. You know what I mean? Because what did we lose? We lost stories from the 1980s. We lost my generational stories. And my great-grandma was born in the late 1800s. So I had access to a generation that touched the end of freedom for indigenous people in America. Geronimo was captured in 1887. It never returned. She was there right in the aftermath. I tell her story in my book. How is it that we've erased an entire generation of literature? Now we're trying to play catch up, right? So I have Ramona Emerson, there's Brandon Hobson. They're around my age. You know, they're in their 50s and they're publishing. But there are so fewer of us out of Gen X than there were the generation before us and now the generation after. And you know, when you think about most cultures, they have a million books on the shelves about people getting a divorce or people losing a job or people dying from cancer. There are a lot of those books. There are not enough Native books to cover the diversity of the Americas yet. We deserve to have books that reflect narratives and counter-narratives, you know, differences among indigenous people, like a multitude of cultural angles, because we have such diversity just among Native Americans. We deserve to have books that are about middle-class concerns, a book about the politics of, you know, of voting or something, or books that are just pure romance stories or travel stories. Instead, the publishing industry wants us to bear our traumas and tell this sort of trauma narrative. And I'm very excited for my second book, which I've gotten into at about 30 to 40,000 words, because do you know how many professional Native women I know who are lawyers and doctors and business owners and librarians and public health researchers? And I have never seen any of them in any kind of book, right? We always have the reservation, the poverty. It's always the same story. And I was really happy to squeeze into this book the welders and the carpenters and the mine workers, because there's this terrible stereotype about indigenous people, and I guess it comes from the government having defined us as wards of the state. We own land, but we can't borrow against our land as capital to build anything on it, right? We're always wards of the state, which suggests that we can't pull ourselves up, that we can't improve our own lot in life. And that was never, ever my experience of indigenous men growing up. My dad had 3 jobs before he got his first good-paying welding job. He was a garbage man, he was a mail delivery guy at night, and he changed brakes and did oil changes at a gas station. Like, he worked, he didn't sleep. He was trying so hard to get us out of poverty. And I know so many indigenous fathers who are like that, and we don't see them on the page. So we need a broadening of representation, and we need an overturning of the stereotypes. And that only happens as we get more and more people to publish. So I'm always telling my students, I do not believe in a scarcity mentality. At my school, in my program, we're mutually supportive. We want everyone to be published. That is the way that we're going to roll. We're going to celebrate each other. We're going to help each other. We're going to promote each other. It has really lessened the burden on me to be working in this field, because before I kept thinking, I have to change the world with my one book. You know what I mean? And you squeeze the life out of art when you care about it so much. And I cared about it so much. I rewrote and rewrote and rewrote this book so many times, you know? And then when I got there, I thought, how wonderful. Now I can relax because I get to be a small part of her success and his success and their success. And it's like, you know, I get to be maybe the new Native American Toni Morrison, like, giant comes through my program, and I got to help edit their thesis, you know? The burden isn't all on me anymore. And so it's got to be a community thing. It has to be, and I keep telling everybody, if you read the book and you like the book, tell your friends, leave a review on Goodreads or on Amazon, because this is probably one of the most healing things that we can do as a culture, is to gain sovereignty over our own stories. We have been so excited by the success of the television show Reservation Dogs, and 2 of those screenwriters came out of my program. And it just makes everybody feel better because we're like, look, there are people on TV that look like us and that know our stories. You know, it seems like a small, dumb thing, but it's a really real way that you all can help by supporting Native literature and Native storytelling that is told by us ourselves. Thank you so much.